Hi, I'm Dr. Jeremy Neal, and I'm a professor of philosophy at Houston Baptist University. In today's mini lecture, I want to talk a little bit about Blaise Pascal and his famous wager. Pascal was a philosopher, a Frenchman, who lived in the 17th century and was very important in the development of mathematics, including especially conic sections and also probability theory. Pascal was a committed Catholic, a participant in the Jansenist cause, and he developed a famous proof for the existence of God, which might be called a fideist proof, because it's not necessarily a proof based on reason as much as it is a proof based on faith. And here's how it goes. Every human being, according to Pascal, faces a choice. He can either believe that God exists or not believe that God exists. And at his death, there are a couple of options. Pascal thinks one option is that God, it turns out, exists. And the other option is God, it turns out, does not exist. Now, every human being must wager, according to Pascal. You have to wager on God's existence. Whether God exists or not is something you have to decide for yourself. Not to wager is to wager. So not to wager, to be agnostic about it, to say, I'm not sure whether there is a God, is in fact to wager, because upon your death that becomes a no wager. You wagered that God does not exist. Now suppose you wager that God exists and you live your life in accordance with this wager. You go to church regularly, you do good deeds for the poor, you restrict your desires, your impulses, your sinful behavior, you trust in God for your salvation, and you die, and it turns out you were right, God does exist. What do you get? Well, you get a life of eternal happiness and flourishing as a result of your good choices in this life. And what do you give up? You give up a certain number of finite pleasures. Every sin is sweet for a season. You give up finite pleasures which might have given you some immediate degree of pleasure in this life. So if you wager that God exists and he does exist, it turns out, then you get a whole lot on balance, because you get infinite happiness at the expense of a number of finite pleasures. Suppose you wager that God exists and it turns out he does not exist. What do you get? Well, you might get the reward that comes from living a life of virtue, a life lived in obedience with God. There's a certain amount of self-development. There's a certain amount of strengthening and virtuous development that comes from being good and honoring God's promises. And what do you give up? You give up the opportunity to experience certain sins. But both of those things are finite, if indeed it is true that God does not exist. And that's important, and I'll explain its importance in a minute. Suppose you wager that God does not exist, and it turns out he exists. And you wake up on the other side, he exists, you're totally hosed. You lived your life thinking that he would not exist, and it turns out he does. So what happens? Well, this is what Pascal thinks. What you got during this life were a few cheap sins and the pleasures that come from them, and what you gave up basically is a life of eternal flourishing and happiness for a life of eternal punishment. According to Pascal, that's an infinite loss versus a finite gain. Finally, there's a fourth option. Suppose you wager that God does not exist and it turns out he does not exist. You were right. You gained the pleasures of your sinful life, and you lost the virtues that come from living a life of obedience to God, and the happiness and flourishing that comes from living a life of virtue. Now, Pascal thinks on balance it makes sense to wager that God exists, because if you wager that he exists and you're right, you get an infinite gain versus a finite loss. If you wager, though, that God does not exist and you are wrong, you are risking an infinite loss versus a finite gain. So Pascal thinks that on balance it makes a lot more sense to wager that God exists. Pascal's wager is a very interesting argument for God's existence. I want to make two comments here at the end about its efficacy. The first comment is that Pascal was operating within a Judeo-Christian context as a faithful Catholic. So he was just assuming a Christian framework for his fideistic wager. At the same time, though, it seems possible to run the wager not just for Christian belief, but for any theistic view. You could run the wager for Hinduism, you could run the wager for Islam, you could run the wager for any one of a number of different theistic points of view. So it doesn't strike me as though Pascal's wager is a particularly good argument for the existence of a Judeo-Christian God. However, and this is the second comment that I want to make here at the end, Pascal's argument is, I think, a very good argument for the existence of God as such, because it seems to me to be a convincing demonstration that a stance of atheism does not pay. It's not an effective sort of a stance on living one's life, because atheism risks infinite loss, whereas it only gives one finite gain, and theism gives one an opportunity for infinite gain and risks only finite loss. So Pascal, in summary, offers, I think, a very interesting and insightful perspective on human psychology and on the possibility of God's existence in his wager. And one of many reasons why I am a theist, I'm a Christian philosopher, one of many reasons why I am a theist is because I think that Pascal's wager is a convincing argument for God's existence.